So that's something actually I kind of wanted to touch on this, because one of the questions I always see is, you guys used to place importance on resolution and now you're doing less so. Why is that? And this is something that's really interesting to think about, and it kind of ties into the history of both displays and the pixel counts themselves. Like, before Digital Foundry, there was CRTs. I still use CRTs. They're great. But the way they handle resolution is fundamentally different than like a flat panel display. And resolution just didn't really matter back then. Like, you could have 320 by 240 pixels and it looks glorious on a CRT, and the art was made for this. But once, I think pixel count only really became important once we made the jump to flat panels in general, like LCDs, plasma, and the like. And so when Digital Foundry was first founded, before any of us were a member of it, Richard had just kind of started this thing off. Pixel counts mattered a lot, and I'll tell you, it's because of two things. First of all, when you're it's the pixel, the number of pixels in general was much lower, right? So you're dealing with like 720p usually at the most. So the difference between like 720p and like 600p was pretty significant. Like, it's fewer pixels than, say, like 4K versus 1800p, but in terms of the perceptual difference, it's massive. This ties into two other things then: the anti-aliasing itself. Besides MSAA, which was generally too expensive, anti-aliasing was really in its infancy back then. It didn't handle like temporal aspects of the rendering. You get a lot of shimmering and noise on that as well. So it just wasn't up to the task of dealing with low pixel counts, which is part of the reasons why Switch games tend to be okay with also low pixel counts, because they're using these modern techniques. And then on top of that, you have the screens themselves, which if you have like a lower resolution flat panel display and the output of the game doesn't match the pixel grid on the display, it becomes noticeable. So it's especially bad when you have fewer overall pixels. And you can go all the way back to like a handheld. Like, you try to play like an emulated game on like an original DS and it doesn't match the resolution. It looks horrendous. And that's the problem here. It's like you have a 768p screen, which, by the way, there were almost no actual 720p displays back then. So everything was always scaled. And then when you add in, so you're scaling from 720 to 768p, but then the game is under 720p. You have all this upscale blur, these nasty upscaled pixels that are just blurred to heck. The anti-aliasing can't keep up, and it just looks bad. So that's why during the PlayStation 3 and 360 era, it mattered a ton. Then we get to Xbox One and PS4. And for the first time, we were actually getting games that could match the pixel resolution of most flat panels. Most people were starting to use 1080p at that point. So having a game get the native resolution of that was actually pretty important. When you dropped under that resolution, it was noticeable. But it was, I'd say, less of a problem than it was during the prior era. Anti-aliasing was starting to improve, though it was slow at first. And I don't think that a 900p game necessarily looks bad, but a 1080p game definitely, you can see the difference still.
Sure.
But once we get to 4K, from a normal viewing distance in the living room, and then you add in all these new anti-aliasing techniques, it becomes so much more difficult to actually perceive pixel differences, to the point where, honestly, from my viewing position, something like 1800p versus native 4K, I can't actually see the difference during normal gameplay from my seating position. To the fact that, when we were playing PS3 games, I could see this difference just playing the game, and it was distracting. Now, to see the difference, I actually have to capture the file, bring it over to the PC, go through frame by frame, and actually compare and contrast and like look for tricks and, frame cuts and all this stuff. I mean, if you put your face up to the 4K screen, you can actually see that, okay, maybe it doesn't completely align to the pixel grid, but from the way you would normally play, it's very hard to see. And it's just, that's why it's changed. It's because the technology has changed. Yeah. So we have changed with the technology, and now pixel counts just aren't as important anymore. And this is due both to the displays, but also the hard work of developers that have poured so much R&D effort into essentially conquering shimmering. right? Like that's where this is all about. This is about getting rid of that noise, the shimmering artifacts you get when the image moves around, and that's what brings us closer to pre-rendered visuals, and we're getting really close to it now, I think.
Yeah, we never